Shall we get started? Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the IWM for what is, in fact, the final public event of 2022, the IWM's 40th anniversary year. We're very glad that you've joined us for our extensive event program over these past 12 months. My name is Katherine Younger. I am a permanent fellow here at the IWM, where I also oversee our Ukraine and European dialogue and documenting Ukraine programs. It is a great pleasure tonight for me to get to introduce Mischa Gabowitsch, who is a historian and sociologist, currently a visiting fellow at the IWM, and Lisa Meitner Research Fellow at Reset at the University of Vienna. He's published very widely on issues of protest and social movements, commemorative practices, and war memorials, with a particular focus on the Soviet Union and its successor states, while all looking widely around the world for comparative and examples that can be put into conversation with that context. At the IWM here, he's working on a project on commemorating the Soviet experience in World War II, 1945 to 2055, so we'll see if we get there. Tonight in his lecture, he will discuss the interplay between state ideology on the one hand and local practices on the other in memory of the Second World War. I'm particularly excited to welcome Mischa tonight. I know he's been working extensively on a project on the Kherson region in Ukraine, and I hope that we will get to talk about that as the night goes on. So Mischa, I will turn the floor over to you, and then we'll discuss afterwards.
Thank you, Kate. And I will actually start with what you just mentioned. In the Soviet tradition, the part of the Second World War that started with Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union is referred to as the Great Patriotic War, or the Great War for the Fatherland. Even though now Russia is, in a sense, following in the footsteps of Nazi Germany in its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russian propaganda has amply drawn on the commemorative culture surrounding the Great Patriotic War to justify the invasion. One of the tropes it uses refers to Ukraine's supposed neglect of memorials to that war and to other military conflicts, and the associated commemorative practices. The problem with this claim is that most such memorials in Ukraine are in excellent shape. They have been regularly maintained, and Ukrainians have used them as venues to celebrate dates associated with the Soviet commemorative calendar, such as Victory Day on the 9th of May or local liberation days, as well as dates that are part of the new post-Soviet Ukrainian canon. So, in order to create a semblance of improvement, the occupiers have engaged in what I call spurious reconstruction. One of the main techniques used for this is to paint the monuments in multiple, often garish colors. This is done, for example, to highlight individual elements of a monument, and it is even done to bronze statues. This kind of polychromy not only goes against the intentions of the sculptors and architects, it would also have been considered blasphemous in Soviet times, and indeed, at least until very recently, in post-Soviet Russia. But what makes this use of paint relevant to the topic of my lecture is that it actually follows established practice in Ukraine, especially in rural parts of the country's eastern and southern regions. Mykola Humaniuk, my co-author for a book about the treatment of war memorials in Russian-occupied Ukraine, documented many such cases well before 2022. He interprets them as instances of local residents wishing to express their reverence for the monuments and what they represent, and improvising new ways of doing so in the absence of a central authority that would police commemoration. So what is happening here is that the Russian state is taking up a locally developed commemorative practice that was not previously part of its own repertoire, and using it in support of a claim that it is returning to normal after a period of mnemonic neglect. What I argue in this lecture is that this is essentially how the Soviet and post-Soviet commemoration of the Great Patriotic War has evolved since the very beginning. The history of Soviet war commemoration has often been described as a battle between myth and memory, between state propaganda and the truth, between ideology and people's authentic experience. This view was especially popular in the Soviet Union itself during the period of glasnost or transparency in the late 1980s. At the time, new revelations about previously taboo aspects of the Second World War came to light almost every day. Many people felt that the state had been hiding the truth from them. That truth was now making itself heard in the form of memoirs and declassified archival documents published in journals and books printed in hundreds of thousands of copies. Debates raged about the cost of victory, the lives lost to due to the Soviet political and military leadership's incompetence and cynicism, the categories of people previously invisible in public discourse, Soviet prisoners of war, victims of the Holocaust, Volga Germans or Chechens deported to Central Asia during the war. For the first time, people were listening to some of those who had fought against the Soviet Union, from Lithuanian or Ukrainian nationalist fighters to members of the so-called Russian Liberation Army that had fought under German command. Critics felt cheated not only by how the story of the war had been told, they were also fed up with the public rituals performed to commemorate it. These rituals felt increasingly stale and meaningless, especially to some of the school children forced to participate in meetings with aging veterans who would tell identical stories every year. Then there was a contrast between the official rhetoric that no one is forgotten and the actual treatment of war participants, both living and dead. Volunteer searchers were unearthing soldiers' bodies that had been left to rot in swamps and forests. Elderly veterans were feted on high holidays and accorded certain social benefits, but also denied basic dignity by a crumbling system of medical care and provision of basic goods. To many people, it felt like the whole military commemorative complex was a hypocritical endeavor by the state to suppress people's authentic memory, a big myth whose main purpose was to prop up Communist Party rule. This was also the perspective from which the history of war commemoration was now narrated, giving rise to a number of myths about the myth of the Great Patriotic War that are with us to this day. According to this critical story, war veterans had returned home after victory, proud of their achievements and expecting a greater say in running the country. Victory Day had been an authentic popular celebration until Stalin abolished it in 1947 to suppress the veterans' push for liberalization. He banned the memory of the war almost entirely, purged cities of war invalids by shipping them off to the Karelian island of Valaam, and stopped the construction of war memorials on the territory of the Soviet Union. War commemoration didn't restart until 1965. That year, the new Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, brought it back because he felt sentimental about the war, wanted to glorify his own exploits in it, and was looking for a new basis for regime legitimacy to replace the cult of the October Revolution. This account of Soviet war commemoration proved extremely tenacious. It quickly spread to the West through a number of publications that amplified the voices of disillusioned Soviet and post-Soviet intellectuals, especially Nina Tumarkin's highly influential 1994 book, The Living and the Dead, a personal essay that very elegantly and forcefully expressed the mood prevalent among the Russian urban intelligentsia at the time. We know now that much of this account is false or at least misleading. Large parts of it are anachronistic, speculative, and centered on the experience of a few large Russian cities, but ignoring the other Soviet republics and the countryside. Other parts are simply a gross oversimplification. One of the most problematic implications is that of Stalin or Brezhnev single-handedly designing a commemorative culture at the drawing table and then pushing a big red button in the Kremlin to turn it off and on at will across the Soviet Union. My point in this lecture will not be to show in detail what is wrong with this traditional account. I have already done that elsewhere. Instead, I would like to try out a lens that might allow us to understand how the Soviet culture of commemorating the Great Patriotic War has evolved from before the war was over until today. As the archival record shows, this culture was created by multiple actors. The Soviet party state was certainly crucial to its development, but it was not always a monolithic actor that pursued a set of coherent and homogeneous commemorative policies everywhere. The people who contributed to the emergence of the Soviet culture of war commemoration included generals in Moscow and local army officers, military engineers, ambitious sculptors and architects, writers and composers, local historians and museum workers, party bosses in individual Soviet republics and members of cultural institutes or architectural committees, the heads of factories, kolkhozes, and local executive committees, zealous school teachers, anti-religious activists and propagandists, diplomats eager to improve the Soviet Union standing abroad, and, of course, former front soldiers and bereaved relatives. So how do we make sense of their interaction over the past 80 years? I would like to suggest that in order to do so, we need to go beyond what could be called the hydraulic model. This model postulates that the state applies pressure to impose its own commemorative culture, but sometimes when the pressure is relaxed or imperfect, the suppressed truth seeps through the cracks. Instead, let us view the process as a dialectic. What do I mean by that? Collective memory never evolves outside of any social framework. Even the earliest and most bottom-up commemorative practices in the wartime Soviet Union were never completely divorced from the framework developed by the party state and its propaganda apparatus, which set rules for how people were supposed to make sense of it and later remember it. Most bottom-up commemorative activity was not directed against this framework, but rather sought to fill it out and improvise within its boundaries. In the process, it generated new symbols and practices, which, often unintentionally, could go beyond what the party state had originally envisaged. While the state suppressed some of these practices, it ended up embracing others, co-opting them and integrating them into its own bureaucratic repertoire. But by doing so, it inadvertently transformed that repertoire, adopting elements it had repudiated before. In what follows, I would like to illustrate this thesis with examples spanning the entire period from the Second World War until today. But before I do so, it is very important to stress what I'm not arguing. First of all, my point is that local commemoration and the state repertoire have always been constitutive of each other and mutually influential. But of course, this has never been anything even remotely resembling an equal relationship. The state's management of war commemoration was always selective, contradictory, and geographically unequal, but when it concentrated its resources to enforce or police a practice in any specific location, no one could stop it. Sometimes the hydraulic model is not completely wrong after all. In the territories formerly occupied by the Germans and their allies, immediately after liberation, school children were made to write essays about their experiences. As Mykola Borovyk has shown, the objective was to train them in the ideologically correct way of talking about the occupation, to learn or relearn to speak Bolshevik. Alternative accounts did occasionally surface all the way until the end of the Soviet system, but the boundaries of what could be said at the most public level were quite clear, and direct challenges to it were sanctioned in no uncertain terms. In the realm of monument building, we know from Arkady Zeltsev's path-breaking book Unwelcome Memory that Holocaust survivors managed to build many hundred memorials to their murdered relatives across the western region of the Soviet Union, usually in small towns, rural areas, or outlying districts. Yet attempts to memorialize the Holocaust's largest massacre at Babyn Yar in Kyiv were systematically suppressed. It wasn't until Glasnost and the collapse of the USSR that post-Soviet states began including previously taboo categories of heroes and victims in the commemorative repertoire and discourse. So when I speak of mutual influence, it should be understood that just like any dialectical relationship, this one was far from equal. The second and related point is that the relationship I'm describing has not been one between the state and the grassroots, if by that latter term we mean ordinary, perhaps subaltern people, equipped with few cultural resources and capable of wielding only the weapons of the weak. Without denying the agency of regular people who had experienced the war, we must note that the initiative in commemorative culture was usually taken by people invested with some authority or access to symbolic resources: school teachers, local historians, museum workers, etc. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, it is in no way my intention to exonerate Soviet state propaganda regarding the Great Patriotic War or its post-Soviet Russian, Belarusian, or other successors, or to deny that commemoration was often put to cynical uses both at home and abroad. In pointing out that Soviet and post-Soviet commemorative culture has been more complex and has had more authors than is usually acknowledged, I rather hope to explain why this tradition has proven so tenacious and why it has been able to reinvent itself through so many attacks, political and societal transformations, and generational shifts. Even those who would like to reform or abolish it should understand why it has such a hold on people, lest their efforts backfire. Turning to empirical examples, let me start with monument building practices. Very often when we read even historians' accounts of, let's say, the 1940s and 50s, they will use the passive voice. They will say monuments were built, or they will say the Soviets built war memorials in all these different places. But the question is, who were the Soviets? So, unlike many European countries, actually most European countries, the USSR had rejected the cult of the First World War. Its leaders considered symbols such as eternal flames or tombs of the unknown soldier to be bourgeois and un-Bolshevik. And they would never create a centralized agency such as the Imperial War Graves Commission, the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, or the Commissariato Generale per le Onoranze e Caduti, all of which were created after the First World War in Europe, to build and maintain war memorials. So outside of a few well-known examples of large monuments, typically in city centers, most early Soviet war memorials were built by military engineers or local sculptors and architects, frequently on their own initiative, or at the behest of local army commanders, often without sanction from the central political authorities, or even unbeknownst to them. But how did they come up with ideas? So, a few albums were published centrally in Moscow or the Republican capitals. This is an example from Minsk, that included model designs that people were supposed to implement. But they were very slow to reach the formerly occupied territories, where monuments were actually being built. And many, many monuments constructed at the time did not follow the suggested designs. One intriguing alternative source was the rediscovery of Tsarist-era war memorials, both inside the Soviet Union and abroad. Shortly before the war, Stalin had started rehabilitating the Tsarist-era pantheon of Russian military heroes and the cult of Russian military glory. Now, when members of the Soviet military would come across older war memorials during their westward advance, they would feel that this national turn gave them license to praise them and propose them as models for new Soviet war memorials. Thus, one Soviet officer would later write to the Soviet leadership that he had been struck by a monument he had seen outside Poltava in Ukraine at the site of the Russian victory of 1709, and suggested building similar roadside victory monuments to mark the repulsion of the Germans during the recent war. And he even sent in some designs. Another intriguing example is Alexander Gundrov, the head of the Slavic Anti-Fascist Committee, created during the war to drum up support for the Soviet war effort among foreign Slavs, and himself a military engineer. In 1946, Gundrov wrote an ecstatic report from Bulgaria about how the whole country was covered with monuments to the Russian soldiers who had liberated Bulgaria from the Ottoman yoke in 1878, and people were treating them with great respect and reverence. He proposed that similar monuments, listing Red Army soldiers who had died in the recent war, should be erected in the new People's Republics, and he later produced an album with photos of a new monument to Soviet soldiers that had been added to the communal grave of Russian soldiers who had died at Plevna in 1878. But regardless of such prior models, a lot of unsanctioned monument building activity was going on as early as 1943 in parts of the Soviet Union that had previously been occupied by the Germans and their allies. The files of the Ukrainian Architectural Committee in particular are full of cases when the Ukrainian Republican authorities only learned about a monument or even an entire memorial complex or military cemetery after it had been built, often with the acquiescence or open support of local executive committees. In some cases, such as the military cemetery in Stanislav, the former Stanislavov or Stanislaviv and present-day Ivano-Frankivsk, the committee thought the results had been terrible from an aesthetic point of view, but destroying a recently built cemetery would send the wrong message. In other cases, the members were simply peeved that nobody had consulted them. Thus, in 1946, it was found that in the Voroshilov-Rad, present-day Luhansk region, a group of local sculptors had been building war memorials without Kyiv's or Moscow's consent and without following any of the official models. But instead of punishing them, the committee members allowed them to proceed with building what would become one of the iconic monuments of Soviet and especially Ukrainian Soviet war memory, the Young Guard monument in Krasnodon, completed in 1954. Perhaps the most impressive example is that of what appears to have been the first eternal flame installed in the Soviet Union. A type of memorial, let me remind you, that was still considered bourgeois in the early 1950s, just like tombs of unknown soldiers. It was put up by a veteran who headed a factory in the small new town of Pervomaysky near Tula, in memory of soldiers who died in the area, but also to demonstrate the achievements of the Soviet gas industry. We have gas, so let's have an eternal flame. The eternal flame template quickly spread across other parts of the Soviet Union, touched directly or indirectly by the war. So none of these examples of monument construction were in any way directed against the Soviet canon of war commemoration. Rather, they sought to give forceful expression to feelings such as grief, pride, and, of course, patriotism within that canon. But in doing so, they sometimes came up with new forms that had not previously been part of the official repertoire, and which, if proposed publicly to the central decision-making bodies, would almost certainly have been repudiated as un-Soviet. As it happens, however, many of these forms were quickly taken up and became canonical. Turning from monument construction to other forms of commemoration, many of the practices that later became associated with a state-mandated cult actually developed from below in the late Stalinist era. Some former front soldiers started giving speeches at factories and enterprises in the late 1940s, long before this became a state-supported, let alone a mandatory practice. In Moscow, in Vladivostok, and especially in Kyiv, there were associations of veterans of certain units or branches created on the initiative of the veterans themselves. Some remained informal, while others were incorporated into local party, military, or sometimes museum organizations. The Ukrainian Republican Association for Aiding War Invalids had over 100,000 members when it was disbanded in 1951. Some teachers organized battlefield visits for school children as early as 1946. By the late 1950s, rest homes for vacationers offered cultural programs focused on local history that involved veterans sharing war stories around campfires. Museum workers from the Republican capitals and other cities started collecting artifacts during the war, and in the post-war years they created temporary and permanent exhibitions or even specialized museums, and in formerly occupied territories organized local history tours for young people that involved sites of partisan struggle, working with a range of local history buffs. By the end of the 1950s, such tours, as well as meetings with former partisans and Red Army soldiers, had become such an expected part of pedagogical activities by schools, museums, and the Komsomol that party committees would censure districts where such activities were deemed insufficiently frequent. In addition to sites of heroic battles and partisan struggle, tours eventually came to include places of memory for some civilian victims of war. So once again, all of these practices were compatible with the official commemorative repertoire, while gradually modifying it from within, and turning Victory Day and other holidays into occasions to celebrate the achievements of regular soldiers rather than the Soviet army as an institution, which had been the understanding before. The only major alternative source of remembrance practices was religion, with its traditions and symbolism, which continued to dominate individual funerals even in Moscow as late as the mid-60s, and naturally extended to commemorating the war dead. The need to have a place for such commemoration had been a frequent argument used by Orthodox petitioners, sometimes with success, to keep churches open or reopen closed ones during Stalin's highly circumscribed liberalization of church policy between 1943 and 1948. In rural areas in particular, such memorial services continued to be held even through the anti-religious campaign that Khrushchev launched in 1958. Belarusian village dwellers put up crosses in memory of fellow residents burned alive by the Germans. Holocaust survivors installed tombstones with Hebrew biblical inscriptions. In smaller towns and rural areas, such practices were often tolerated well into the Khrushchev era or even beyond. Another source for the commemorative repertoire were the vernacular Christian rituals of protection and gratitude that had been widespread during the war itself. Prayers, pilgrimages to holy wells, baptisms, and relic veneration. Carrying crosses or heavenly letters, processions with icons circling or connecting villages, and finally, victory processions. Some of these are documented throughout the final years of Stalinism and into the late 1950s. The historian of religion Ulrike Huhn interprets them as a combination of mourning the dead, coping with the trauma of war and survivor guilt, and preparing for an imminent and even more destructive new war, with Christians now increasingly picturing the expected conflict as one between the Soviet Union and Western powers, rather than one between believers and a Bolshevik Antichrist. All of these aspects, of course, were prominent in the secularized commemorative culture that would later spread through urban Soviet society. The partial rehabilitation of the Russian Orthodox Church and its integration into the USSR's peace propaganda on the international stage seems to have contributed to stripping religious commemorative practices of their subversive potential, facilitating their later evolution into secularized rituals. These new secular rituals were intentionally introduced as an alternative to religious ones, with help from ethnographers who had closely observed mass religious rituals during their fieldwork in rural parts of the country. They formed part of Khrushchev's twin campaigns launched in 1958-59 against vestiges of religion and to raise the quality of life in the countryside. In 1964, for example, the Rivne Regional Party Committee in Ukraine organized the Day of Commemorating the Dead in the form of a quasi-religious civic memorial service at a cemetery. In practice, this looked like one of the Remembrance Days introduced since the late 1950s in a number of Western regions, taking root especially in Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, and Ukraine, but eventually spreading as far as Kazakhstan, expressly as an attempt to strip the tradition of taking care of relatives' graves after the spring thaw of its religious overtones, with dates varying locally between early May and early June. So what's important to understand is that until the mid-1960s, all of these practices were particularly widespread in parts of the Soviet Union that had seen foreign occupation, from the Baltics to Moldova and western and southern parts of Russia, but perhaps especially Belarus and Ukraine. And in particular, the rural areas that had seen most of the fighting and dying. What has often been called the onset of a cult of the Great Patriotic War in the mid-1960s could in fact be described as an urbanization and, maybe with a little bit of an exaggeration, a Ukrainianization of Soviet commemorative culture, perhaps akin to what Sergei Plokhy has described as a Ukrainianization of the Soviet political leadership in the 1960s. In 1965, Victory Day, the 9th of May, which had been celebrated all along with varying degrees of effort, was given the status of a work-free holiday that it had lost in 1947, along with Victory over Japan Day on the 3rd of September. 1965 was the first time ever that a military parade was held in Red Square to celebrate Victory Day. And it inaugurated a huge program of monument construction and commemorative practices that now spread well beyond the formerly occupied parts of the Soviet Union, all the way to the Far East, eventually creating the kind of homogeneous commemorative culture familiar to those who grew up in the late Soviet period. This move in 1965 has often been interpreted as a single-handed decision by Brezhnev, but recent archival research, my own, but also that of colleagues such as Kira Walter, paints a much more complex picture. International politics was a large part of the reason. Reminders of Soviet sacrifice during the Second World War were in part a response to a debate about the statute of limitations on Nazi crimes in the West German Bundestag. They were also a reaction to the Vietnam War, and the first big parade was in part a sales pitch to the most important clients of the Soviet arms industry in Asia and elsewhere. Yet domestic developments were no less important. In numerous letters to journalists and political leaders, veterans of the Red Army had been clamoring for public recognition and increased social benefits. But the first proposal to turn the 9th of May back into a work-free holiday and reserve it for commemorative activities of various kinds came from Petro Shelest, the recently appointed head of the Ukrainian Communist Party. Writing to the Central Committee in Moscow in 1965, January 1965, Shelest mentioned that, quote, "New rituals and customs to immortalize the people's heroic feat are emerging and spreading ever more widely." And he named a number of specific regions of Ukraine where this was happening. Shelest suggested taking up these new practices and developing them across the Union. And indeed, when the status of war commemoration was raised later that year, the new commemorative culture included few, if any, elements that hadn't already existed before in Ukraine, Belarus, rural Western Russia, or elsewhere. While some in the Soviet leadership might have envisaged the new military commemorative complex as a return to the immediate post-war era, when Victory Day was a work-free holiday at home and the Soviet Union's military reputation abroad was at its peak, what they actually did was to take a repertoire of commemorative practices that had developed over the past 20 years and turn it into a compulsory part of school education and the annual ritual cycle across the entire USSR. Once this was done, it in turn encouraged people to come up with new local or corporate rituals that were also eventually integrated into the canon. Many of them developed in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, tied to specific locations, professions, army branches, etc. So in the interest of time, let me now jump to the post-Soviet era to mention a few examples of how a similar kind of dialectic has continued to unfold since the collapse of the USSR. My first example is something that most of you will be familiar with, called the St. George's ribbon. This is a commemorative symbol developed in 2005 and initially based on the colors of a military award that had existed in pre-revolutionary Russia and was then revived under Stalin. So as a commemorative symbol, this was launched in 2005 by a Moscow journalist. And the ribbon was originally intended as an inclusive, supra-ethnic and supranational symbol of patriotism and war sacrifice that expanded Soviet commemorative traditions to include pre-revolutionary elements and was, by that token, criticized by Russian communists and others in Russia. It was inspired, actually, by the British poppy worn in remembrance of the First World War, and the idea was that these ribbons would be sold with the proceeds going to ailing veterans. That didn't catch on, and instead it quickly became associated with loyalty to the current Russian state and was turned into a token of allegiance for Russian-speaking minorities outside Russia. But its origins as a semi-private initiative have also meant that individuals have continued to participate in its distribution. And as late as last year, I saw people at commemorative ceremonies in different places combining the St. George's ribbon with, for example, the colors of the Ukrainian flag. So implicitly, they are repudiating the connection between Russian memory politics and this style of war commemoration, but also making it very easy for Russia to co-opt them into its own memory politics model. An even better example is the Immortal Regiment. This is an initiative that was created in 2012, initially, and this is very important, by a group of liberal journalists whose TV channel was actually later closed because it was deemed too critical. And their idea was that they wanted to individualize the Russian culture of war commemoration. So they thought that by parading through city centers with portraits of relatives who had somehow contributed to the Soviet war effort, they would kind of decenter the culture of war commemoration from the president standing atop the mausoleum watching a parade to a culture that would celebrate the individual contributions of all the millions who had fought, and many of them died, to defeat the Nazis. So what it is essentially is a procession with portraits, and at least according to the initial idea, with portraits of someone who was a member of your family, even if it's not a person who actually fought in the war, and someone who contributed to the war effort by working in a factory, or even someone who was a prisoner of war, etc. But the second and also very important element is a website where people can post and publish the stories of their relatives and add biographical elements, photos, etc., etc. So this is actually an excellent example of how new commemorative initiatives that have sprung up in the post-Soviet period actually continue to draw on state resources, because the Immortal Regiment in this form would have been impossible without something called OBD Memorial, a database, massive database of previously unpublished records from the archive of the Russian Ministry of Defense that was published by that ministry shortly before this initiative took off, allowing people to reconstitute the wartime biographies of their relatives that then become the basis for the personal stories that they tell on this website. Now, the Immortal Regiment initiative is often seen as having been entirely captured by the Russian state by now, and I won't go into the detail of the debate surrounding it, but many people will say that Russia has essentially turned it into a state-sponsored and even state-mandated event. Now, empirical research shows that this is actually a vast oversimplification. If you talk to local organizers, both in Russia and in the many, many other countries to which this has now spread, you will hear that many of them are extremely critical of the Russian state and its attempts to co-opt them. But to the extent that it is true, it's important to note how that co-optation has once again modified the state's commemorative repertoire. So Putin can no longer afford to simply watch a military parade from the mausoleum. He has to join the ranks of the Immortal Regiment, as he has been doing every year since, I think, 2014 or 15, with the portrait of his own father. So, to sum up, the Russian state has actually invented very little in the realm of war commemoration. But it has demonstrated a remarkable ability to co-opt commemorative practices that ultimately reflects people's desire to honor their ancestors and feel proud of their achievements. In the process, it has repeatedly altered and broadened its own repertoire and adapted to new social developments. But, and here I'm starting to speculate, we may well have reached a point that is similar to what happened in the late 1980s, when state-sponsored commemorative activities came to be seen by many as inflationary, vacuous, and self-defeating. The more it tries to swallow local initiatives and meanings, the more this state-sponsored culture becomes open to critique. So to return to the example that I started with, these kinds of claims about the Ukrainian state supposedly having neglected or even destroyed war memorials for anything between 8 years and 30 years are extremely easy to debunk, precisely because the ways in which the Russian occupiers try to illustrate their claims draw so much on a local Ukrainian commemorative repertoire. And also, increasingly, these practices once again become not just state-supported, but state-mandated, stifling the very initiative that is necessary for the dialectic to continue, right? So the reason that this whole history of war commemoration has developed in this dialectic fashion is that there have always been surprising numbers of sort of interstices where things could develop and flower until eventually they were then co-opted into the state's repertoire. And the more pressure the Russian state now applies to make everyone toe the line and participate in practices that are now part of the bureaucratic repertoire, the less interesting this becomes for people. So the question is whether this time round, this state-sponsored commemorative culture will find yet another way to reinvent itself, or whether we are about to witness the demise of really a multi-generational commemorative tradition associated with Victory Day, similar to how Germany's defeat in the First World War essentially spelled the end to the Sedantag, which was the de facto national holiday of the German Empire before 1914. I will stop here, and I look forward to your questions.
So thank you so much for this, Mischa. It was really fascinating, and I think you're making a very compelling case for this dialectic relationship here.
It's a nice image to have people look at.
Yeah. By
Let's leave
popular
this one.
vote. Yes.
That's cute.
So I'm going to take advantage of my position here, and before we open up to the audience, one of the things that happens here that I want to know more from you about is what happens in this transition between Soviet and post-Soviet, right? Because to me, that it strikes me as what you're telling here is a story that is a union-wide story to some degree with local specificity, all of these sorts of things, right? So the Ukrainianization, as you kind of compellingly call it here, and that's very interesting about Shellist, and maybe we can talk about the Ukrainian 60s at some point as well. But so if you have this union-wide story, that's very different than a Russian-specific story. And that's also, then again, very different than the story that Russia is trying to impose on territories that it's newly occupying, right? So could you talk a little bit about the transition moment there, and then also the claim that you're trying to make about the imposition of this on the newly occupied territories, potentially bringing down the cult as a whole?
Yes, very important question. So I would say that there are two things happening in that transition. One is a nationalization of war memory and war commemoration, which are two related but different things, which generates very different forms in different Soviet successor states. But in their differences, they are actually very similar to each other. So what actually happens in almost every post-Soviet country, and especially in those that do not try to entirely repudiate this Soviet tradition. So the Baltic states maybe are a separate story. But in almost all of the other post-Soviet states, there's a nationalization where people want to talk more and more about their own national heroes. So in Kazakhstan, for example, people start building new monuments to Kazakhs who had been awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, or they start nationalizing existing Soviet memorials by stressing the ethnic identity of some of the people mentioned there. And this happens in Russia, in Ukraine, Central Asia, etc. There's also a new religious component, which we also find everywhere. So in Ukraine, for example, especially in rural Western Ukraine, what you find very often is that people basically leave Soviet war memorials in place, but they take off the red star and replace it with a cross. And then maybe they change the wording a little bit. So I have a wonderful photo that I took in the village of Stoyaniv, which is in the northern part of the Lviv region, where you have one of these, very, very typical Soviet soldier statues. And people chiseled out the word Soviet from a formula that says, to those who fell in defense of the Soviet fatherland. So, the fatherland remains, Soviet is gone. And then they put up a cross instead of the star. That's it, right? So this also happens very frequently, and there are lots of kind of hybridized things. So in Kharkiv, for example, there's a wonderful, wonderful memorial complex which was recently damaged by the Russian attack, but is still there, which is I think it's called the Park of Military Glory, and north of Kharkiv, which is built around a kind of Soviet era, I think 1970s, early 80s memorial complex. But then in the post-Soviet era, in independent Ukraine, they added something that looks like an Orthodox chapel, but with little kind of cenotaphs on top that look like some of these standardized models from one of the catalogs that I showed from 1946, but which also have crosses. So this kind of hybridization is extremely common. And then in places like Kyrgyzstan, for example, you find memorials with Islamic symbols. So this is very cool. So this is kind of a diversification where each republic kind of tries to talk even more about their own ethnic and, in some cases, religious contribution than it did in the late Soviet period, because this is a process that started under Soviet rule. But then also what we have is a transnationalization of the whole thing. So one of the things that I find fascinating is that you have all these Soviet war memorials that were built outside of the Soviet Union, very early on, starting in 1945, 1944, 1945, everywhere from what was then still Königsberg to Bulgaria. But ironically, of course, when the Soviet Union existed, most people from the Soviet Union were unable to visit these places because it was very, very difficult to get a permit, even to go to a brotherly socialist country. Now that the Iron Curtain is gone, people can travel freely, right? To the extent that they have the means to do so. So we have all these transnational practices that develop. For example, what I've called in one article, secular military pilgrimages, where people try to, for example, retrace the path of some military division from their home region, and invariably they end up in Berlin at the Treptow Park Memorial with, for example, like a helmet filled with coal from the Donbass region that they then deposit. And I've been to Mount Athos, and the similarities are striking, right? So there are all these things where, for example, these volunteer searchers, right, the poszukiwcy or poiskoviki, they are extremely well connected. And even, to be honest, I haven't really looked at it this year, but during the first phase of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, starting in 2014, they were still in contact with each other across, the Ukrainian-Russian border and even to other countries. I spent many years following a group in Berlin that was set up by a guy from Tajikistan, who basically devotes his entire life to renovating Soviet military cemeteries in Eastern Germany. And he's in touch with people all across the former Soviet Union. This has become, in a sense, a transnational culture, much more than it was during the Soviet period, also because of all the new emigre Russian-speaking communities. So the Immortal Regiment, for example, was started in Tomsk in Siberia in 2012. By 2014, it had spread to Israel. By 2015, it had been taken up in Germany, Canada, Australia, the US, etc. So wherever you have people with a Soviet biographical background, by now sometimes even in the second and third generation. So people who were born in Israel, the US, etc., but who want some way of sort of, getting respect for their parents' or grandparents' achievement as, now a kind of minority in the new country. They engage in these practices and they get in touch with people in other countries. So it's a very transnational thing, and the fact that this commemorative culture has now become the focus of memory wars does not contradict that, because this transnationalization, in a sense, has created kind of an international arena in which these things play out, so that we have these memory wars not just inside Russia or inside Ukraine, but across the internet, for example, or in diaspora communities.
Very interesting. I'm curious. I'm going to push you though on this final point about the newly occupied territories, practices there, and how you're envisioning or are seeing through your research them impacting back domestically, right? Because you're saying that this is going to undermine. This has the potential, right, to undermine this dialectic practice. How is that going to transfer from the newly occupied territories?
Because some of this stuff is just so ridiculous. For example, what they're doing a lot now, and this in a way echoes some of the worst things that we saw in the late 1970s, is to basically force school children to reenact the war. Mm-hmm. So you will see not just soldiers, but sometimes children in uniforms with like mock rifles being made to stand in front of war memorials, reenacting the poses of those memorials, and reciting poetry or singing songs, etc. So it's very clear that in the vast majority of cases this is not grassroots, homegrown, local initiative, and it's very easy to show that, right? It's very easy. Partly the work that Mykola and I are doing kind of demonstrates that very clearly, where, for example, you have people who are obviously not from the places where supposedly they are honoring their local ancestors. And once again, you can show that because you see videos of their speeches where they're getting facts wrong and mixing things up. referring to the wrong location, etc., etc. So I think that, in a sense, just like for many people, not everyone by far, in the late 1970s and the 1980s, this whole sort of commemorative culture had begun to feel completely absurd. Yeah. This might now be happening with its exaggerated use as a tool of war propaganda. But as I said, I'm really speculating here, and we might well be surprised by yet another kind of cycle of reinvigoration.
That's interesting. All right, I'm sure there are questions from the audience here. I would ask you to make sure you introduce yourself, because I see faces I don't know here. Yes, please. Marina, do you mind passing?
Thank you. I am professor of, until being pensioned, of environmental management. I am not a professional historian, but I am very close to everything which was happening and is happening in Central Eastern Europe, because I was working also sometime for United Nations as an environmental diplomat, and I know all the countries, the former Soviet Union, Eastern European countries, and Central Asia. So therefore I'm very much interested in what you said, and there's still some question I would like to ask your opinion. And one is about the treatment of that period commemoration in literature. For instance, like people like Solzhenitsyn in his times when he was still critical, and not now, of course, now he's dead. Just an example. Or Vasily Grossman, who wrote Stalingrad, and some other. Okay, so this is the first question. The second is about the persecution of organizations which try to give more objective pictures. The memorial, just an example. There are others too. And one question is about, you mentioned a little bit a Russian Orthodox Church. Which position and role does it have at this moment concerning this commemoration? And maybe the last one, since we are in Vienna, what do you think about the memorial in the center of Vienna? I find it very revolting to see that there is a quotation by Stalin. That's enough. Thank you.
Okay. Lots of questions, thanks. So this allows me to make a point that maybe I should have made at the beginning of my talk. So in my work, I try to distinguish between narratives about the war, commemorative practices, and what, following Alexander Etkind, I call the hardware of memory, memorials. So a lot of people have done excellent work on the narrative side of things, right? And in fact, I would say that 90% of the studies that have been published on war memory in the Soviet Union and the successor states concern narratives and discourse, right? So, I could give a whole other lecture about this, and many other people are even more qualified than I am to talk about these things. So in a sense, this is not my focus in my research, right? So you could talk at length about things that could be said, things that couldn't be said in literature, in historical research, differences between different Soviet republics, differences between different eras, etc. That's in a sense not my point, because I find that when we focus on commemorative practices, that allows us to see things that remain hidden if we talk only about narrative, right? Because you can have a narrative that doesn't really outwardly change, but because the commemorative practices around it change, the whole, what I call the military commemorative complex evolves, right? And I think, some of the examples that I gave are illustrations of that. And, the Immortal Regiment is a good example. I mean, they didn't set out, in a sense, to really change the narrative about the war. It wasn't about, let's talk about new groups that we haven't previously talked about before. It was basically about taking the existing narrative and sort of individualizing it, right? And finding practices that might express this individualization. So, I don't think I have anything original to say about either Solzhenitsyn or Grossman that hasn't been said by many other people before. Now, regarding the persecution of organizations, now, once again, I mean, this could be treated as a question about discourse and narrative, right? So, what are the things that can be said, and who's allowed to say them in, a country like present-day authoritarian Russia? But from a different perspective, it's also a question about commemoration, because, of course, Memorial, for example, was one of the actors that tried to create, maybe, I hesitate to say an alternative commemorative repertoire, because what I find interesting about some of the commemorative practices associated with Memorial is that actually they sort of evolved out of Soviet tradition. So if you've ever been in Moscow on Lubyanka Square on the 30th of October, which is the day when Memorial and many others commemorate victims of the Gulag system, actually, a lot of what people do sort of follows the Soviet commemorative repertoire that initially developed around the war. And the kind of individualization that we've seen with people, for example, reading out aloud the biographies of individual people who died in the Gulag system is also not entirely different from what people have been trying to do as part of the Immortal Regiment with war memory. So once again, if you look at this from the point of view of commemorative practice rather than discourse, you see a lot of interesting similarities and echoes. But of course, you're completely right that any type of organization that tries to commemorate Soviet-era crimes and completely leave the sort of state-defined boundaries for doing so is now at risk of being closed down. So, I mean, in a sense, with Gulag memory, the official state museum of the Gulag that was opened in Moscow a few years ago has, from the point of view of the Russian state, taken over from Memorial, so Memorial is no longer needed, right? And a lot of the kind of the culture of commemorating the crimes of the Soviet state has now migrated to that museum and the Association of Gulag Museums across Russia. So once again, there's no outright ban on mentioning certain things, but make sure that you mention them in a way that is not seen as a challenge to the current Russian political system. And that I think is also an interesting dynamic. And you're also completely right to mention the Russian Orthodox Church. And, I think it would be only a very, very slight exaggeration to say that a lot of symbolic and commemorative policy has been outsourced by the Russian state to, on the one hand, new organizations such as the Russian Military Historical Society, but also the Russian Orthodox Church. And in a sense, the Russian Orthodox Church has emerged victorious out of its sort of implicit competition with Memorial in commemorating, for example, the victims of the Soviet system, where it now gets to manage, for example, memorial complexes for people who died in the camps, and obviously talks much more about people who died as martyrs for religion than about anyone else. And just as maybe a final example, there's a series of multimedia theme parks about history that were opened in dozens of Russian regions a few years ago called Russia My History, which were co-developed by at least people associated with the Russian Orthodox Church, and which present a very kind of state-centered and church-centered vision of Russian history that, of course, glorifies all the great military victories. Schwarzenbergplatz. So once again, the one thing I'll say about this is this. So I'm not just a historian, but also an ethnographer, and I spent many, many years, 10 years actually, observing commemorative activities around the Treptow Park Memorial in Berlin, which is the biggest Soviet war memorial outside of the former Soviet Union, and which also has very visible inscriptions of Stalin quotes. Now, whenever I was there, and we would usually there with a team of people, we would ask people, so what do you think of these Stalin quotes? And one of the typical answers was, what Stalin quotes? So this is an interesting phenomenon because very often people who approach these memorials, as sort of critical intellectuals, for them this is the first thing they see. And they're shocked. How is it possible that in a place like Vienna or Berlin, or by the way, Poznań in Poland, we still have Stalin quotes on a memorial in the 21st century. But what you have to understand is that the vast majority of people who approach these places as practitioners of commemoration, they have a very, very different perception. And very often, many of these kind of outwardly symbolic elements that we immediately perceive remain completely invisible to them. So for them, for example, what's more important is, wow, I have seen the silhouette of the Treptow soldiers so many times in textbooks and newspapers, etc. And now for the first time I'm here. Wow. Or there are so many others here who have come on this great day to, celebrate the great heroic feats of our forefathers. I am so happy that I'm not alone. I don't care. They don't approach it as, a museum or a memorial where they have to kind of look at everything. They don't approach it with an evaluative frame of mind. It's much more about sort of an intimate connection that they feel to this place, which is why when critics say, look, this memorial has this and this and this reprehensible symbol or inscription, so we need to get rid of it, a lot of people perceive that as an attack on their personal intimate connection with the memorial, because for them it's not about what is written on the stone.
Ludger, I saw you had a question as well.
Do it first. Ludger Hagedorn, permanent fellow here at the IWM. Thank you, Mischa, for this really inspiring talk and for the lot of material that you presented. I really think that this was a rather descriptive approach, which is totally fair and totally fine, because I think this is what also justifies having the very many photos that you have shown to us. Nevertheless, I'm interested in something maybe that is more complicated to talk about. And I would say commemoration is always like following a certain goal, or if we do not want to make it so instrumental, I would say commemoration has a underlying motivational structure. I would be more interested in that. You have mentioned it at some points of your talk very clearly. So at one point, and the clearest reference I have heard in your talk was when you were speaking about the motivational structure as grief, pride, and patriotism. I said it was this formula of three motives that you once mentioned. It was very convincing how you describe this change from like local usages or even personal motivations behind, and these concepts being overtaken by the state later on. I think, first of all, it is not just a passive overtaking. I mean, that is there is a selection involved. There is an active overtaking, leaving out very, very many other ways of commemorating. This would be one thing I'd just like to mention. And my question would be, what happens to this motivational underlying structure that is there? Couldn't we, for example, say that grief is very often a motive that plays a very, very big role for those local people, for the individuals that commemorate, but it is more or less lost when it becomes a public practice. I think I understand that this is very difficult to talk about because this structure is always a melange. It's never very clear what it is. So, but nevertheless, I would be interested in hearing more about this.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me that you see this as a descriptive approach, because to me this was a kind of experimental attempt to sort of rise a little bit above my material, because what I'm trying to do is to write, I've written about so many different aspects of war commemoration, both historically, especially in the 40s and 50s, and about the post-Soviet period, and but mostly in exotic languages like Russian and German that nobody reads. And now I want to write this sort of survey in English, and I'm relatively clear about sort of the empirical, historical parts that I want to structure the book around. But I'm still kind of groping for an overarching framework, and this notion of a dialectic was my attempt to not just give examples, but to try and see how they might fit together over this entire period that I'm describing. But that aside, so your question is a very relevant one, but I would be very careful with the kind of language that uses terms such as goals and strategies, right? So, the kind of the province of sociology that that I come from talks about different regimes of engagement. And the strategic is only one of these regimes, right? So there are other regimes that have to do with, for example, intimacy or experimentation. And I think it's very important to understand that for people who engage in these commemorative practices, very often they don't see themselves as being in a strategic regime, right? Of course, some of it has to be strategic because they have to plan out the events, etc. But very often it's about feeling an intimate connection with a certain story, with a monument, with a practice, a tradition, etc., which is why this is such an emotional experience, and why some of the conflicts surrounding commemoration are so emotional, because it's, for a lot of people, it's not a question about how strategically to behave in a certain situation, but what their most profound emotions are. So having said that, maybe two things. So one is that because this culture and language of commemorating the Great Patriotic War has become so pervasive, it is now used for everything, right? So I've worked with anthropologists who worked in very remote parts of rural Russia, and they say that the Immortal Regiment has arrived in small villages, but people use it basically to fight out their local conflicts. So it's all about, he's my friend, he will march in the Immortal Regiment with me, and this other guy I don't like, so he has to go to the other Immortal Regiment. So basically, people use the language of war commemoration to fight out conflicts that have absolutely nothing to do with the war. Because it's basically, the closest thing that Russia, Belarus, and to a much lesser degree other post-Soviet countries have to, a kind of a universal political language. So just like, I don't know, Americans will argue about the Constitution, people in Russia will argue about, the war, or will phrase conflicts out through this. But the other way of replying to your question is to look at generational dynamics, and I think this is maybe the most important thing to consider here. So, in a sense, for the first generation, for people that had actually participated in the war, it was, I guess, a way of, coping with trauma, just like, any other group of people who survived such traumatic or similarly traumatic events, which means that a lot of people actually refused to engage with it altogether. For a lot of people, the 9th of May was essentially an occasion to get drunk. So it was basically about very intimate experiences. And by the mid-60s, it was very much about people who had been very young soldiers during the war, now reaching positions of some social influence and authority. and being able to use that to, command respect and fight for additional resources, social benefits, symbolic standing. And, Mark Edele, for example, is a great historian who's written a book about the veterans movement in the Soviet Union, where he basically argues that point very well. So, essentially the culture that many of us know from the late Soviet period was one where people who had participated in the war sort of basked in the admiration that they were now getting from the younger generations. And one of the typical rituals was school children giving flowers to veterans, etc. And then, the children, of course, were the generation that was essentially fed up with this stuff in the late 1980s, to simplify quite a bit. But what me and my colleagues have found to an astounding degree in the post-Soviet period is that whenever we talk to memory activists who are among the main organizers of commemorative activities anywhere, I mean, this goes for, provincial Russia, for Berlin, Tel Aviv, I don't know, anywhere where you have a community that engages in these kinds of practices. The typical activist at the core of these activities is someone who is now maybe in my age, in the kind of 40s, late 40s, 50s, who's a grandchild of someone who fought in the war. And the grandparents usually died just before these people started thinking about these things, right? And they're trying to sort of recover a connection. And usually what they talk about is not so, obviously the war itself, but also their memories of growing up in the 70s and 80s and, going to these monuments with their grandparents. So in a sense, you have a dynamic that's very, very typical of, intergenerational memory transmission everywhere, where the relationship between parents and children is very fraught, especially around these traumatic events. But then once you get to the grandchildren's generation, there's a lot of kind of simplification, romanticization, memory becomes cultural rather than communicative. And it's a lot about, we have to celebrate the heroism of our grandparents and, very importantly, pass it on to our children. So the other motivation that we hear again and again in our interviews and in our observations is, I arrived in this new country and I realized that my children are now being taught a story in school that's different from the one that I was taught. So I want them to know the truth about how heroically their great-grandparents fought. So I would say that, obviously, as you said, there's always a mix of motivations, but if I wanted to kind of reduce it to a common denominator, in a vast majority of cases, it's about intergenerational dynamics, which is what makes it so easy for the Russian state, for example, to come in and offer its models, because people are interested in this stuff for reasons that initially have nothing to do with, patriotism, grand national narratives, but they want to inscribe their family stories into something larger and more meaningful. And it's very easy to do that when you already have this sort of commemorative offer.
Okay, so we're going to go with Carlos, and then Karl-Henrik, and then Raphael.
Yeah, thank you. Carlos Frankel. I'm a guest of the Institute for another couple of days and a scholar of philosophy and religion. So a question about religion, because you mentioned religion, I guess mainly Orthodox Christian, but also Jewish, as one of those bottom-up, grassroots, local commemorative practices that competes with the official commemoration of the Great Patriotic War. And I get, of course, that religious groups are concerned about, let's say, the well-being of the soul of the dead soldier, right, in the afterlife, and they want to secure that they find a spot in paradise and so on. So that part of the motivation I understand, but I guess what I'm trying to figure out is how can religious groups give meaning to the death of the soldier? So I take it that according to the official narrative, the explanation for why the soldier died is both for political and for patriotic reasons. So they died defending the communist system against Nazism on the one hand, and they died for the defense of Russia against Germany. So you have the patriotic and the political cause, which explain the sacrifice. But how can you sort of replace that or compete with that from a religious perspective? Like, how can you sort of convert the Soviet soldier into a religious martyr? Can you somehow say that they died defending, I don't know, Christian civilization against an atheist aggressor? It seems to me sort of at first view far-fetched, but maybe this kind of interpretation is possible nonetheless. But that's sort of what I've been trying to to grasp. Thank you.
Carlos, I envy your obvious lack of contact with the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, Jesus could turn water into wine. The Russian Orthodox Church can turn anything into a story about Russian imperial greatness. So I get it that you're asking mostly about the post-Soviet period. So okay, so the answer would be different, I guess. And in the 1950s, which is the main period for which I mentioned these Soviet era examples. So first of all, it wasn't necessarily so much about the Soviet soldier, and in fact, one of the tensions was that very often people were kind of officially expected to honor Red Army soldiers who had died liberating their region or their village. And gather around these memorials, but they were often more interested in commemorating their own relatives who had died maybe elsewhere. So often the communal graves for soldiers who died in this area were actually neglected until quite late in the day. But people would, for example, gather in cemeteries or in churches. But very often in cemeteries to sort of commemorate the dead from their own families. And, I don't think it's very problematic to make religious sense of an evil enemy invader, Gog and Magog, coming into your country as, basically the host of the Antichrist and trying to destroy you. And then you kind of heroically repelling them. And as I mentioned, and this is not my idea, this comes from historians of religion, I think this sort of precipitated a shift from a lot of Christian believers in particular thinking that the Bolsheviks were the enemy, to them thinking that the Germans, but then by extension the West, were the real enemy, coming to destroy Orthodox Russia. Now, in the post-Soviet period, it's not a problem at all, because basically you now have license to add religion to everything. So very often, I mean, there's one of my favorite examples among thousands is a TV series that came out, I don't know, by now maybe 10 or 15 years ago, called Strafbat, which was about the penal battalions. That really existed, and there were basically people taken from prison camps, labor camps, and sent into battle to redeem themselves. And the final scene of that whole TV series is, for some reason, an Orthodox priest standing over a battlefield strewn with dead corpses, and then the Mother of God rises above him as a sort of protector of Holy Mother Russia. So essentially, it's been very easy to argue that even though the Bolsheviks technically were atheists, really unbeknownst to themselves, they were doing God's work, right? And this is the typical story. And in this book that I'm writing now with Mykola Omanyuk, we have these amazing examples from Russian-occupied Ukraine, where, for example, in one place, I think somewhere in the Zaporizhia region, you have an Orthodox priest leading a celebration for Victory Day, right? 9th of May, singing a famous song from 1975 about Victory Day, День Победы, and talking about how really the fighting, this is completely wrong historically, but has become a popular trope. Really, the fighting had ended on the 6th of May because that is the day of St. George, the holy patron saint of Russia, and God, of course, wanted to, send a sign. So this is really very, very easy to do. I mean, once you have sort of ideological permissiveness and the ideology that's symbolized by United Russia, where everybody is good because they were all part of Russian history. So you can put Sakharov and Stalin on the same poster, and that's fine. So basically, all of Russian history was, openly or implicitly divinely inspired, and now we can finally talk about that openly. So not a problem at all.
Karl-Henrik? Oh, Marina, up here.
Karl-Henrik Fredriksson, Debates on Europe. Thank you for an extremely interesting lecture. My question would be less interesting than the ones before and a little bit more concrete, and actually also a little bit outside the scope of your speech. But I allow it because I allow myself to pose it because you mentioned it. You mentioned pre-Soviet monuments, as you talked about Bulgaria, the liberation from the Turkish yoke, but you also explicitly mentioned the monument in Poltava celebrating the victory of Peter the Great's victory over the Swedish King Charles XII, and some allies, including Ukrainian Cossacks and so on. That monument, these monuments inspiring a surge of Soviet memorial practices and monuments, but are these pre-Soviet Tsarist monuments? In Poltava right now, there's a huge discussion about that particular monument that has nothing to do with the Soviet thing, but it's being reevaluated, of course, in the new light of a kind of raging new Russian imperialism. Are there other examples of these pre-Soviet monuments that are becoming part of memory wars now that they hadn't been before? A kind of re-evaluation of not only of the Soviet period, but of the pre-Soviet period.
Yes, plenty, of course, in Ukraine in particular. So in Ukraine it's obvious, yeah. Elsewhere, that's a good question actually, because when I heard the first part of your question, I thought, great, now I can finally talk about the legacy of the pre-Soviet monuments in Soviet times, which I love talking about. But you're actually challenging me because I don't think I've looked at this outside of the Ukrainian context. Let me think. Nothing immediately comes to mind. I mean, no, really, I'd have to think about it more. Sorry.
Rafael?
Thank you, Mischa, for your talk. And as far as you convincingly showed and convinced me that the establishment is in Moscow is a vampire that can successfully drink the blood from all the victims and turn it into its own advantage, as now it's ironic or paradoxical that the very center of the power that killed people in the, let's say, 30s, 40s is making a new political deal for itself, actually benefiting on this very blood. I'm still skeptical whether this overpowerful state is able to do a reconciliation between nations. And now my question. So every time that I visit my family house and talk to my grandparents born in 33, 36, they could, from the perspective, understand both the moment of liberation when the Red Army came and what it brought to them. And they are not, intensely anti-communist. No. At the same time, when the war started against Ukraine, I started to listen to people from Moscow on Transnistria, how they remember the war, especially the old people. And they could not see those two elements, like that what liberation and victory meant for them. It meant something completely different for the people that were liberated, according to what they call liberation. So do you think there is a way, and the memorial and such initiatives could be still pioneering those models that could spread another type of pluralizing this memory and individualizing, as it was shown that this movement was done by Russian liberals? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very, very good and important question. So I think the problem is that some people were probably hoping that by individualizing and personalizing memory, you could get rid of the conflicts. But that hasn't really worked out, because if you want to individualize mass memory, you need some sort of narrative framework into which you can inscribe it. And people essentially have relied on a framework that was proposed to them by the Russian state to a large degree. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible. So I do think that there are elements in the Soviet commemorative tradition that would lend themselves to this more sort of pluralistic commemorative culture that you're talking about. But of course now is the worst possible moment to create this. I was in a discussion actually last week with several Ukrainian artists, and Evgeny Belarusets, who's a brilliant Ukrainian writer and artist, said something that I think is precisely the answer to this question. Drawing on Jean Piaget's developmental psychology, she said that what we really need is, I think it's called deconcentration, where people who look at a monument become capable of seeing more than one meaning, right? So nowadays, with all the memory wars that are going on, you have activists from one side coming in and saying, well, this monument is about the glorious feats of our forefathers, and this is the only way to understand it, and anyone who approaches it in a sort of different frame of mind is the enemy. And then from the other side, you have people who say, well, this is a monument to Soviet soldiers, and Soviet soldiers were evil rapists, so we have to get rid of it, right? What gets lost in these debates is that very often monuments, as I was saying, illustrating with reference to the Berlin one, have multiple and multi-layered meanings to different people, which often go beyond what the monuments ostensibly stand for, right? And often, in order to understand these local meanings of the monuments, you really have to, go in and spend some time with people who frequent them and understand what that's all about. And but then also perhaps make these people see why some others might take issue with these monuments. So I think we would need a whole different culture of sort of polyphonic commemoration, which Ukraine, in a sense, tried to develop starting in 2014, when, for example, it introduced the 8th of May as a new commemorative date in the calendar without abolishing the 9th of May, right? So one was about victims of the entire Second World War, and the other was still Victory Day, slightly reinterpreted, but still Victory Day in a sense in the Soviet tradition. But that really is more kind of placing people side by side, and letting each one of them have their own thing. And I'm not sure it led to a real dialogue between different understandings. I think the best thing that could happen in terms of developing this kind of pluralistic commemorative culture would be for what I call the Russian military commemorative apparatus to disappear. And essentially, not for the commemorative culture to disappear, not for people to stop caring about the Great Patriotic War and their family histories, etc., but for these attempts to monopolize the meaning of that commemorative culture through centralized agencies to fail. And this is something that really, has started in earnest in the post-Soviet period, under Putin, essentially. With now, I was mentioning that the Soviet Union never had these agencies like the Imperial War Graves Commission. Now they have the Russian Military Historical Society, which tries to act in this manner and to, centralize monument building, centralize the organization of commemorative practices. And I think as long as we have that, it will be very difficult, even outside Russia, to find a sort of polyphonic commemorative culture, because anyone who steps even a little bit towards the sort of the Soviet end of the tradition will immediately be co-opted by the Russian state, provoking reactions from the other side. So I guess the ideal would be for all of that to disappear, and people in each region getting a chance to have a dialogue about what the war actually means to their particular place, which is very different in Transnistria or in Moldova or in southeastern Poland than it is in Siberia or Kyrgyzstan. And I think people need to get a chance to talk about all these different local meanings. But it's a challenge.
So that brings the local point of it back in, where we started with thinking about the dialectic that's happening here. So thank you, Mischa, very much for this fascinating lecture. Thank you all for your questions, and thank you for joining us for this last lecture of 2022.